G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and it's Friday midday here in Australia, so I hope you've had a great week, and I will see you on the weekend, and I hope that you're having a great time as well. I won't judge you if you don't watch my videos on the weekend. You've probably got better stuff to do, but today we do have, as always, a lot to go over, and I am fearing how long this video may be, and come and join the conversation in Telegram too. So we are going to look at the news and the maps straight off the bat. We need to talk about an F-16 which has crashed and has killed the pilot. We need to talk about nuclear power plants and what is evolving there. Of course, we will look at the maps and we'll look at geolocations, primarily in Kursk, where Ukraine has launched the offensive, and in the Pokrovsk-Avdiivka front, where we are seeing Russia making ground, and some geolocations to line up maybe differently to the maps. And to link all of that together, I want to talk a lot then about the need to maybe return to maneuver warfare, maybe deep maneuver warfare, the attritional warfare phase that we're in, and will we continue to see that prolonged attrition continue too? So we're going to look over, I'm going to belt feed you a lot of information at the end regarding historical references, doctrine, Soviet doctrine, Western doctrine, and how we are seeing the war currently then unfolding. So there's going to be a lot in that. Now, one thing I want to say is, like you, I am learning as we go. Ukraine, Russia, China, America, all the experts here, from the military commanders to those that write the articles and doctrine, everyone is learning. So with this war, it's hard to know where this is going to go. And of course, a lot of people will get things wrong. And this is one of the things I see that influences so many, not only decisions, but the way people report is they have a set conclusion in mind of X will win the war, this will happen here. And if you have that set conclusion, I think so many are missing maybe some little movements in here, because if you see this movement, but your set conclusion is, well, X or Y will win, you may disregard the importance of this or increase the importance of something as well. But this is the first conflict where we've seen modern air defense meeting modern aircraft, drones from state-made through to just off-the-shelf private companies, mixed with men and guns and fighting in trenches. And the only way of telling that we'll actually have a conclusion of this war is time. Time will tell us how this is going to end, what mistakes have been made, what has worked well, and where the next battles may be then won or lost. But this war has not yet been determined, nor will a single battle determine this. And we will speak on that in length over some books, doctrine, everything at the end. But there has been an F-16 crash, it's been destroyed, and the pilot has been killed. Now, there is very little information on this so far, but a state investigation by Ukraine has been opened. So this first broke from the Wall Street Journal. The US-made F-16 fighter jet crashes in Ukraine. Now, this is all that we've got at the moment. Initial reports indicate the jet wasn't shot down by enemy forces, although the incident did occur during a massive Russian missile barrage across the country on Monday, which we then reported. Now, yesterday there was a Facebook post that a Ukrainian mayor did give, pointing that an F-16 pilot had been killed, but it wasn't actually enough evidence at the time to report. I just didn't think it crossed the threshold of reporting that, as it is, of course, massive news. But beyond the little information we have, we're not really sure what has actually occurred. Now, the gentleman that lost his life in this was Alexei Mess, pictured here in an F-16, went by the call sign Moonfish, and this was the ceremony funeral of Alexei. Now, what actually happened here, we don't know. Was it purely a crash during that time? Was it struck by something? Maybe his aircraft did intercept something and the shrapnel then brought down the aircraft from an engagement. Many are pointing that it may have been a friendly fire incident with air defense. This, although not spoken about much, is not as uncommon as many would like to think. Of course, look at the Russian jets. There's been basically as many Russian jets come down to a mechanical fault to their own air defense, as well as actually being intercepted by Ukrainian air defense as well. So look, what has actually happened here, I guess there's always going to be some conjecture on. But the investigation, the internal investigation, that will come through of what remedies need to come, and the time frame on the future of the F-16 may be determined a lot on this. Say if it's determined that it was a gap in training, as we know the training has been far shorter than the normal F-16 training, this could have further delay for the F-16 in combat actions within Ukraine. Now, the plane is replaceable, but this is a big hit. Of the 10 F-16s that have been delivered to Ukraine, the loss of one is a 10% hit. Now, losing anyone in war, of course, is a tragedy. But in purely strategy and tactics, losing an experienced pilot with huge amounts of training, well over a year of training, has a massive impact as well on the ability to get those jets up in the air, especially depending on what is determined as the cause of this. And of course, this can have a huge effect on morale. That really the first time we saw that these jets, these supposed game changers, come into play in the theatre of war, a plane and a pilot was lost. The horror of war, especially after the war, becomes more obvious that the best, the bravest, the most driven of the nations are killed or scarred permanently. And there's a good part in a book here that I want to read to you as well. Woe to the statesmen whose arguments for entering a war are not as convincing at its end as they were at the beginning. And that was from Bismarck, that none of the leaders who drifted into war in August 1914 would have done so could they have seen the world of 1918. And I think within the Kremlin there may be some of this as well, especially if we then float our way into a larger scale war from this, or within the Middle East as well. So let's talk about the frontline maps and what is happening. Now, onto the map here. Of course, we have Ukraine in the center, the capital of Kyiv. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The green and blue area where Russia has been and has either been pushed out or withdrawn, except for in Kursk, where some of this still should be green. Now it's over 2 weeks, where Ukraine has launched an offensive occupying areas of Russia. But where I first want to talk is down in Pokrovsk, as this is the most burning area currently, and that northern offensive has really petered out in those large movements. Maybe it's not shown green because the majority of it may be green. But let's move down into here. Now, on the deep state map today, all we see is a small advancement here into Mikhailovka as well, but that is it. But let's then have a look over some other maps that show differently in here, as well as what Deep State has said about the situation in here. But before I look at the maps, let's have a look at then some geolocations. So this is a flag raised in Seledove in this area. Then, of course, a Russian flag raised on this building, and we can get a geolocation due to the spoil out of this quarry. So let's have a look at this geolocation. We'll bring this to the side. We'll zoom in one click, and here we go. We can see the spoil of the quarry. We can see the road running through here. So this flag was raised right about here. So we get a good idea where this has then moved up through here today, getting a better idea of the advancements, then confirming this movement. Now, we have another flag then raised here. Let's have a look at this. Then a Russian unit flag chucked up, and we can see that this near Kalinivka. So let's move down. Now this area is shown only as grey zone, but confirming there is presence of Russian forces on this southern side then of these two reservoirs sitting here. Now there is a lot of different maps that show a far more significant push into Seledove as well. Now let's have a look on Suryak and see where he is showing in here. So let's line this up in here. So this red dot down here, this is Seledove. Now this is the two spoils of quarries, and you can see that he's showing significantly more advance into here, and there are other maps which we don't work off typically, but showing this amount of movement as well, showing far more expansion of control out to the north near Krasny Yar as well, and this push out towards Lysivka too. So we get a good idea where this road bends down in here, the movement around and the capture of areas in here, as well as the push into Horovka as well. Russian army took control of positions in Horovka, about 80% of the town. So many people are saying that this map is not showing the amount of movement that has actually occurred into here as well. We've spoken of the reasons behind some things like this before as well. But again, this is why we compare maps to get a better idea of where things may be sitting. But let's look at what Deep State has said about these advancements. Now, one thing I will say is there's a lot of bloggers ignoring the seriousness of these advances. There's also some bloggers who I think are overblowing maybe these advancements too. It's not like there's been a full collapse and 1,000 square kilometers has fallen through defensive works, although we'll look at the attritional warfare and that grind forward and how that may actually be affecting this also. Interesting publication about the analysis of state affairs in the East came from Roman Panamenko, an officer in Azov Brigade, about the loss of control of the situation in Donbass. For a long time, the situation in Donbass was quite appropriately characterized as difficult but controlled. However, now it is out of control. Currently, it seems that our front in Donbass has collapsed. The defense of the armed force of Ukraine is disorganized, the troops are tired, weakened, and many units are demoralized. The replenishment that is received is mostly bussified and does not help, but on the contrary, complicates the combat work of the units. About the fatigue of both sides, which does not allow the enemy to go far into the depths. The only reason Russians do not break through deeply is because their troops are as exhausted as ours. However, they retain a significant numerical advantage and have unlimited supplies of ammunition. Therefore, their offensive continues. We cannot stop it at the moment, and that is not the reason for the operation of the armed forces of Ukraine in Kursk. So he's pushing back that this is not the entire reason to try and move guys around. We will talk about Soviet doctrine and just that significant amount of equipment flowing into an area as well. And if I can find it, we'll actually talk about a captured German POW that talked about the Soviet advance here. About the search for solutions based on experience of the armies during the Second World War, what to do. There are several scenarios. Former head of the armed forces, Valery Zaluzny, loved to read Soviet military textbooks. That's the reason we're going to go through this from the Second World War, deepening his military knowledge. Our current command should study the German experience of 1944. The Wehrmacht constantly faced large-scale crises at the front and somehow managed to get out of them, in particular the defeat of the Army Group Center in Belarus during the Soviet Operation Bagration. Unfortunately, the problem that narrow military solutions have short-term effect and that only postpone the general defeat as known by the Second World War. The officer doubts that the Russians will run out quicker even at this rate. There are also widespread hopes that the Russians have put everything on this offensive and as a result they will run out of reserves. However, we have been hearing about this for 2 years, but those reserves are somehow not running out. This is what I pushed back on yesterday. This is what we've been hearing for 2 years, is that the Russians are pouring in so many men, so much equipment that it is going to run out. Now, a lot of dates given on that run out have been and gone, and we've seen an increase of men by the Russian forces enter then the area of operations of this war as well. This is why it's so difficult if you've got a conclusion in mind and you overlay that with numbers that may be given, it's easy to read things into something. Sum up everything written above. You need to make changes before it is too late. From the mundane, it would be worthwhile to introduce more effective measures to improve discipline in the army because now the situation is already on edge and forcibly mobilised replenishment only deepens it. This is something of which we've spoken about before. The discipline at the front, discipline of digging trenches, overhead protections, where the guns are facing has a huge effect upwardly as far as strategic level and downward for how the troops are in the trenches, the morale, the psychological effect of having better defensive works and how mobilised soldiers will gain experience there if they can survive longer as well. It's one of the biggest things given in briefing, just about that basic soldiering skill, especially if you're going to mobilise a hell of a lot of soldiers. So, let's have a quick look at Kursk because there's a lot of belief that these two are very interlinked. Now, on this map, we haven't seen any movement for a while except for then today. If we roll back a day and then to today, if anything, Ukraine has actually lost some territory around near Kotonovo. Now, if we jump onto the Noel Reports map, who has been tracking this far more closely, he does show this advancement just out from the north of Podachny as well. but that is the only movement of which he shows on this map now for some time. But we will, of course, overlay this with the Kursk map by Suryak, who does seem to be showing not only more control, but more the fluid daily updates. Now, areas to look at is an area like Borky that Ukrainian army have taken full control over this area down in here, and you can see this by his map, and more expansions out then. If we look where this road runs through here near Martinovka, that has been an expansion out in here shown as grey zone, and further then out to the north as well. So funnily showing actually more control as here too. Clash with the Russian army continues the rest of this access without significant changes. So it has really, really slowed down in here, and many, even I, have speculated, could we see a withdrawal out of here to try and bolster the line that is falling down in Pokrovsk. Now, let's talk about the Russian offensive on the axes down here, and you will see when we come up, we can see that there are multiple areas of which Russia is pushing. Now, attritional warfare doctrine does say to push on several points until one starts to plummet their morale, then plummets while you're falling back, then abandoning more and more built up positions. And many will laugh at Russia's very slow advancement. At this rate, it won't reach Kiev till 2055. But that slow advancement is the reason why this is so hard to counter as well. If you're advancing, digging, not overextending. Although there has been some say that Russia may be overextending in here, and it may open up the opportunity for Ukraine to conduct some sort of flanking maneuver in here. But I think one of the big parts of this and this attritional advancement here is the Russians, along with their doctrine, which enables the quick regeneration of forces and absorption of losses, and has had a far more doctrinal approach to then attritional war. Now, we're going to talk about maneuver warfare, and I'm unsure if then the Russians actually ever want to return to maneuver warfare or Soviet deep maneuver warfare doctrine. And what I'm seeing as the acceptance of the attritional war by Russia, we haven't seen this on the Ukrainian side. Now, whether this is due to Western doctrinal influence or a lack of both manpower and resources to actually conduct that, I don't think we've seen Ukraine accept that this is attritional, and we have seen this then reflected in the lesser defensive works than Russia has built and the less mobilization of forces as well. Now, this could actually be the correct decision, as if you are numerically the inferior forces, it is then easier actually to conduct a further maneuver warfare and keep Russia on their toes and hit on different areas of the front line. But we're going to talk over that doctrine in a sec. Captain B.H. Little Hart said, in an indirect approach, the object is to seek a decisive strategic advantage, whereas in attritional strategy, the object is to exhaust the enemy by continual losses and depletion of resources, making the ability to replace and absorb losses essential. And this is what I don't understand about Ukraine's strategy. What Zelensky or Syrsky or Zaluzny was saying is, no, we're holding in place to attrit down the Russians, but other areas of their tactics don't reflect this. The mobilization of forces to absorb losses doesn't seem to reflect that, nor does the trench lines, the defensive fortifications, and the prerogative to build those in. That doesn't seem to reflect that either. So I think there's this hybrid between the maneuver and attritional warfare, and we'll see how that goes then into the future. But before we talk at length about that, we are going to have a look over other areas of the map and the nuclear power plants as well. I have a video in here I want to show you as well. This is a Russian makeshift demining boat. These guys got an awful shower, and the eardrums are probably a bit, how you going? There's a mine here. Bruh. I survived. I guess if it works, if it looks stupid, it works. It works. But let's have a look up and down the map. Let's jump then down into the New York front. We're just seeing a small bit of movement out of here, but we do have multiple maps in here from Suryak. One thing I will say, people ask why I use Suryak. It does seem to be awfully reliable. A lot of the time, a couple of days ahead. So he's showing more push out into Toretsk on this front as well. And then the map later on of the same area shows more of a push out near Dusny as well, down in this area. We see where this road is running just out of Druzhba. So is showing more advancement on here than this map itself is showing. Now let's zoom out one, as we have 2 more updates in the New York front. Now, this is where we get an idea of where this movement is showing. You can see down in here, Surak is showing a movement right here, which is the same, at least general area. And then he's showing that this has then actually filled in between this road and right down to this advancement. So he's showing it's filled in right around here, shown by this grey zone as well. Again, we know by the movement there, movement of Surak, that there's 100% been some amount of movement in that area. Now, while we're down in here, let's go just south and the Ugledar front. Now, many are saying that Pokrovsk is not the objective here. It may be overall, but the objective near term is to actually push south to then widen this push they've got in, shorten the front line overall, and have more of an effect if they can get in behind the front line that runs from Zap all the way through to Kudakovo of the defensive works that sit in there. Now let's look at then Ugledar's front. Now no change shown on this map today, but we did see large updates over the past couple of days, and Surak, again, if we zoom in down in here, is showing a movement right in here. Let's line up. Pavlivkia is this red dot, and the movement right up here, which is being shown across the maps as well. We saw this then yesterday, movement. This is why multiple different maps to line up where things are moving. It does seem there's a lot of pushing in Ugledar, a lot of pushing around Pokrovsk, and this push that meet up in here, the southerly push, may be actually the objective in here, more short term, and Pokrovsk may be more long term, where many may believe it is actually somewhat the opposite of this. Now, let's turn this back on and have a look where else has moved on the map. So we need to come up into the north. Now, this is the Pashani front. Let's bring up this map. Now, it is showing similar movement out to the south here across the maps, but I actually believe maybe this one now is showing more of a western push, but it's also showing that Ukrainian army managed to recapture a series of positions northwest of Tabaivka. So saying that there was a pushback in here by the Ukrainian army by Surak maps as well. But we do have a few more updates in here. As you can see down the Andreevka, there has been an update here too. So let's have a look at this. Now, this is not the best to line up, but we can see this Kolomichika, which is sitting right here, that there has been some movement in this direction. Now, does it show differently on these maps? Yes, of course, that is to be expected. But what we can say is if this map's showing movement, if this map's showing movement, in this general direction, 100%, there has been some movement. So let's just push down south of here just a little bit till we get down to what I'd call then the Ternivsky front in here, where we did hear that there was a lot of Russian pushing then a while back, but it seemed to, I guess, peter out a little bit. But we can see in then the direction of, we see Nevsky here, that by the yellow, I know it's not easy to see, I don't determine this, that there has been some Russian advancement up along in here as well. And just to the south of here, then towards Terny itself, that Russia has made some advancement according to Surak too. So there's been a lot of movements on this map. And we'll come right up into the north around Sinkivka, and we do have some geolocated footage of a Russian flag going up. So let's zoom in on this, get a better idea of where we are talking. So this red dot, this is Sinkivka. So right about where my cursor is just here, we have got then this footage here of a Russian flag being raised. We know Russia has had many attempts into Sinkivka, many failed attempts, many flanking failed attempts too, but according to that geolocation, according to then the Surak map, that Russia has had some successes here. So let's move up into Vovchansk. Now, these areas we have not seen move even pre-Kursk offensive, but we have seen this very stagnant in here too. So today, Surak is reporting that there has been some Ukrainian advancement in here on this axis here. Since the beginning of the Kursk offensive, there has been hardly any change to the front line. It is worth noting the recovery of the Ukrainian army and some areas to the northern bank of the Volcha River and east of Teki. The situation of the town of Vovchansk has hardly changed, so just out in here. I wouldn't be surprised at all if we did see a Russian withdrawal out of here to then bolster the forces in and around then the Kursk front, rather than a withdrawal of those forces from Pokrovsk. It would make sense exactly where it is, and of course if you can then have your defensive works back in here. The risk of a Ukrainian major push into Belgorod is definitely present. We hear many people say it's a real chance of this, but if it was desperate in here, we may see those forces move from there as well. We do know there are some more highly trained forces operating in this area. Now, I'm not going to speak on this for too long, but there has been some warning of catastrophic events. This is by the Chief of Staff, Andriy Yermak, of course, Zelensky's Chief of Staff, about the nuclear power plant. 4 power units, Ukrainian power plants, were disconnected from the grid during the Russian attack on Monday. Russia poses a nuclear threat to the world. Their energy strikes are more than terrorizing civilians. This is a conscious decision by the Putin regime to threaten the world with a nuclear catastrophe. We've heard more and more messaging from everywhere from Russia, from the Kursk power plant through to the Zap power plant, of course, occupied by Russian forces, about something going down nuclear. Now, IAEA has today released this. Widespread attacks on the country's infrastructure leading to instability in the national grid is presenting a persistent nuclear safety risk at Ukraine's nuclear power plants, such as attacks earlier this week led to the temporary shutdown and disconnection of some reactor units at the Rivne and southern NPPs, the nuclear power plants. Although no complete loss of off-site power event was experienced at any of these sites, nuclear power plants are heavily dependent on stable and reliable connections to the electricity grid. While none of the plants lost all their access to the national electricity grid, which has happened repeatedly at the ZNPP over the past 2 years, I'm increasingly concerned about the growing vulnerability of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Now, I think in this war, if this war is going to go down tooth and nail for who is victorious and who then loses, there's going to be desperation grow at some point, depending where that moves. And I have given you a lot of information before, and I won't go over in this, but this is some breakdown of why we see false flags, events, maybe to provoke a response, undermine confidence in your enemy from maybe their allies as well, and then demonizing the enemy, or justification for escalation or responses. And when do we see then a false flag event for domestic support, provoking reaction, international support, discrediting the other side, diversion from other issues, and of course number 8 here, when there is preparing for peace negotiation talks to pressure the enemy to make concessions. So I do think that, I'm not pointing fingers at any side here, I do think that we may see further down the line these become more and more relevant. We have seen false flag attacks before in this war. So let's talk about attritional warfare and how I spoke earlier that it seems like Russia has just accepted like the bouncing ball of attritional warfare and the phase of this war from that initial large losses, that initial break-in and push back, and how Ukraine is using a bit of a hybrid. The outside messaging that's going out is we're treating down the Russians doing this, but then the reflection on the mobilization of men and the defense works being constructed doesn't seem to really bring that all together. And that's something that for my where I'm seeing is hard to sort of wrap my head around. But I've been reading this planning on protraction, long war, attritional war, and pieces in this too. While the opening phases of high-intensity conflicts are critical, they are rarely determinative. Like I said, the war has not been decided yet. Temporarily crippled opponents can recuperate. We've seen Ukraine recuperate, and we've seen Russia recuperate as well. The American way of war, with its intense emphasis on speed and precision firepower, can occasionally appear excessively geared towards fighting wars as if they were battles, and thus risks confusing the war winning of campaigns or small-scale actions with the winning of wars. You may have won the battle, but you may lose the war. An equal, if not greater degree of attention should therefore be placed on the study of less operationally absorbing, more deliberate tempo of protracted warfare, and on prevailing at the end of a draining marathon rather than an intense opening sprint. And this guy's whole belief is that war is going to be prolonged, attritional, regardless of how it is with the equality of weapon systems on front lines that we're seeing now, that there's not some gap like this, and that you need to look at winning the war, not winning small battles then within this war. So we have spoken about that there may be peace negotiations coming forward, but we know Ukraine is starting at the 10-point peace plan. We know Russia wants to start at what's happening on the ground and even take areas of which they don't occupy at the moment. And what I've spoken about is, regardless of what you think of these, both of these are very, very far apart. And if this is what's being presented, that those are really dead on arrival. And in my belief at this point, that Russia wouldn't even attend the negotiating process. And we'll talk about trying to win back this in negotiations as well. After much expenditure of blood, treasure, war termination is rendered all the more elusive by the desire to honour sunk costs and by the resultant escalation of commitments to serving to justify earlier military investments and sacrifices. The greater the enemy's effort and cost in fighting for a war, the more he will become committed to his own conditions for peace, thus rendering the prospect of any mutually acceptable resolution all the more difficult. So we have seen how much Ukraine and Russia have poured into this war, that any acceptable condition now, the cost has been so high, will that ever realistically be found? Exhaustion of morale and material rather than finality through battles marks the end games of many wars. So when we look at front lines and areas which you open up, let's look at what Sun Tzu has said. Appear at points which the enemy must hasten to defend, march swiftly to places where you are not expected. And many people pointed towards Kursk of this, that they have to defend this quickly, and that the forces were not expected there either. And many have asked me to reread this as well, talking about warfare, and if you are losing, if your opponent is stronger and pushing you back on the main battlefield and you don't know what to do, make it messy. Stop focusing on the main battlefield. Try attacking your opponent in their home base. Maybe they don't have much military there. Maybe they get confused or start panicking or making mistakes. Maybe you get a chance to turn the tide and win the game. High risk, high reward, exactly what we have spoken about with then the Kursk offensive. But we have seen Pokrovsk speed up by a large amount. I don't care what officials say. We have seen that speed up with then the Kursk offensive. Now, I spoke that it does seem that Russia has more accepted the bouncing ball attritional doctrine, attritional phase in the doctrine of warfare, in the art of warfare. So let's then talk about this and attritional war. Broken into two distinct phases. The first phase begins the initiation of hostilities to the point where sufficient combat power has been mobilised to allow decisive action. You'll see little positional shifting on the ground, focusing on a more favourable exchange of losses and building up combat power in the rear. The dominant form of combat is fire, so artillery, rather than manoeuvre, complemented by extensive fortifications and camouflage. The second phase can commence after one side has met the following conditions. So you've got the first phase, the initiation of hostilities. So we did see in February 24th, 2022, the initiation of hostilities from Russia, going through then 2022, near the end of 2022, that then pushed back by the Ukrainian forces in Kharkiv and Kherson. And then we believe that's when this went into this phase of recuperating losses, dominant form of fires, and little positional shifting. Bakhmut, I don't believe, is a good example of this due to it was Wagner PMC taking the majority of the losses as well, with prisoners conscripted in rather than the Russian armed forces themselves. Now, the second phase can commence once you've newly mobilised forces, whether through conscription or voluntary forces. We have seen Russia recruit a hell of a lot of guys. The enemy's strategic reserve is exhausted. This is very difficult to know, but we do know Ukraine does have manpower shortage and has had large shortages of weapons and ammunition at the front line. Fires and reconnaissance superiority are achieved. You'll never have the full superiority of the reconnaissance now with drones, but as far as numerical advantage of firepower, artillery at the front, that Russia does have this. The enemy's industrial sector is degraded to the point where it's unable to replace battlefield losses. Russia has degraded Ukraine's energy grid significantly down to rolling blackouts around the clock, and the industrial sector is completely reliant on the West as well. So it can sort of be buffered there. You can't really gain this in this war. Only after meeting this criteria should offensive operations commence. So in 2023, we saw basically no offensives. Then we saw early 24, this is when it has commenced. This is what I've said, sort of following that bouncing ball of full acceptance of attritional war. They should be launched across a broad front, seeking to overwhelm the enemy at multiple points with shallow attacks. Intent is to remain inside layered bubble. Russia has several front lines open at the moment, of which I've shown you on the map. You're stretching depleted enemy reserves until the front collapses. Only then should the offensive extend towards objectives deeper in the rear. Concentration of force on the one main effort should be avoided, as this given the indication of the enemy's location and opportunity for enemy to concentrate the reserves at this key point. So you have large attacks across the front line till somewhere starts giving way, and then you try and get then into the enemy's rear. This is what we believe is happening around Pokrovsk. There's still many launched across a very broad front from Robotny through to Sinkivka. Once one area starts falling back, you push a lot harder on that specific area. Successful attritional war focused on the preservation of one's own combat power. This usually translates into a relatively static front, interrupted by limited local attacks to improve positions. Using artillery fires for the most of the fighting. Fortifications and concealment of all forces, including logistics, is the key to minimising losses. The long time required to construct fortifications prevents significant ground movement. Basically all of 2020, end of 22, then 23. An attacking force which cannot rapidly entrench will suffer significant losses from enemy artillery fires. This is what we have spoken about. The concern in Kursk should be, are you able to rapidly entrench into here, maintain those logistics if Russia do push back hard on here with FABs, artillery, tanks, and troops? Especially with winter coming, this is going to freeze. It's going to get very cold. Logistics is going to get much harder. The ground is going to get harder to dig in as well. How will this hold into those months as well? Can that jeopardize other areas? Defensive operations buy time to develop low-end combat formations, allowing newly mobilised troops to gain combat experience without suffering heavy losses in large-scale attacks. Building up experienced low-tier combat formations generates the capability for future offensive operations. This is what we believe 2023 for Russia was. You've gone defensive operation basically the whole time, develop that low-end combat formation, putting newly mobilised guys in defensive areas, very limited offensive work, capability at that point, or pushing, but they have gained experience there. In the case of surprise attack, a rapid offensive by one side may be possible until the defender can form a solid front. After combat solidifies, this period lasts at least 1.5 years to 2 years. Let's call February 22 a surprise attack. Combat then solidified. We saw large to and from very liquid front line, either around Kharkiv or Kyiv or Donetsk, but combat did solidify for a long period of time. There we saw Russia, it seemed, really recuperate and absorb those losses. During this period, major offensive operations should be avoided. Even if large attacks are successful, they will result in significant casualties, often for meaningless territorial gains. In attritional war, any terrain that does not have a vital industrial centre is irrelevant. This is what I've pointed at. Ukraine going on offensive operations at this point in time, have you met those criteria in attritional war? If that's what you're focusing on, the criteria we spoke about in this first part of, you've got the mobilised forces, you've exhausted strategic reserves, you have this superiority, and the industrial sector is degraded into areas which does this have a vital industrial centre? It's always better to retreat and preserve forces. We've spoken about fall back and actually retreat through, regardless of political consequences, regardless of how that looks. That there may be too much obsession with optics. The German obsession with Stalingrad, just because they wanted to capture a city bearing Stalin's name. Putin has been embarrassed so many times through this war. Do you think that the embarrassment of Kursk was more than losing tens of thousands trying to march into areas that have had no real gain or be able to hold ground as well? No, just embarrassing is not going to be enough, and I don't think is enough to destabilise the civilian population in Russia, and it has shown that hasn't really occurred regardless of what other people are saying. Could it occur? Yes. Are we seeing rallies against Putin in Moscow and St. Petersburg? No, not on the large enough scale in that embarrassment. especially if you control the media, and depending where people's views sit, it may have actually just reinforced that and have actually rallied people together more. The goal is to force the enemy to expend vital material and strategic reserves on strategically meaningless operations. A key pitfall is to avoid being dragged into the very same trap that has been set for the enemy. So you are trying to get the enemy to expend their material, their men, their resources on meaningless operations. But that can happen the other way exactly too. When the second phase begins, so after that year and a half, the offensive should be launched across a broad front with shallow attacks, as we have seen. The stretching depleted enemy reserves until the front collapses. So broad front, the front starts to collapse, potentially Pokrovsk. There's then a cascading effect in which a crisis in one sector forces the defenders to shift reserves from a second sector, only to generate a crisis there in turn. As forces start falling back and leaving prepared fortifications, morale plummets. So you push here, you create a crisis in Pokrovsk, and then you push in Ugledar. What we speak about, not to fall into the same trap that you've set to the enemy, has Ukraine, in this itself that we spoke about, created the crisis in Pokrovsk, has fallen into that trap, trying to create a crisis in Kursk. And as you start falling back, you lead prepared fortifications, morale plummets. People speak about the morale improvement of Kursk. I don't think that would have improved at all if you're in Pokrovsk moving back. The attritional strategy centered on defense is counterintuitive to most Western military officers. Western military thought of use is offensive as the only means of achieving the decisive strategic goal of forcing the enemy to come to the negotiating table on unfavorable terms. So Ukraine to go to the negotiating table on their terms, and Russia is on unfavorable terms. The strategic patience required to set the conditions for an offensive runs against their combat experience acquired in overseas counterinsurgency operations, of which we know there's been a lot of involvement in over the past few decades. Probably too much involvement, and too much learnt from that he's trying to be copy and paste into an attritional warfare against an enemy with high-end weapon systems that isn't then moving across. And the military conduct of war is driven by overall political strategic objectives, military realities, and economic limitations. Combat operations are shallow and focus on destroying enemy resources, not on gaining terrain. Propaganda is used to support military operations, not the other way around. So you don't launch a military operation to have propaganda. You launch a military operation and have your propaganda support that operation. Okay, you can probably see in areas that I am speaking about in this. So let's have a look at some Soviet doctrine in here too. That combat in cities, that they do get for the dynamic maneuver. So it's fully realised that the movement through urban areas may result in greater ammunition expenditures and expenditures as well for guys. In the offensive, the Soviets plan for their lead echelons to cut off and destroy enemy forces before they can occupy cities. If this is not possible, the Soviets plan to bypass pockets of resistance with leading echelons and continue to advance bypass enemy held areas are sealed off and may be neutralised by following movement. So that is the envelopment, and this is exactly what we have seen in many different areas. This is why some people are pointing at, if the Russians were using this doctrine for Pokrovsk, it doesn't really look like that yet. Is it more of a southerly push and trying to envelop other areas in here before pushing somewhere like that harder? Interesting to then have a think about. The Soviet Union is prepared to exert itself at great expense to achieve its goals. And it speaks in here about the 20 million plus deaths of its own citizens from the Russian Revolution to the start of World War II. As a nation endured the loss of 20 million people during the World War, its tolerance for sacrifice is very high. It's something we've spoken about. People, Eastern Europeans, especially in this whole area of the world, are incredibly resilient, and the Soviet doctrine, or the Russian army now, is willing to exert massive losses at great expense if it has a goal in mind. The popular Western version of these Soviet operational and tactics principles is very brief: objective, offensive, surprise, maneuver, and mass. This list does not fairly characterize the basis on which Soviet military leaders plan to conduct operations and tactics, just as they add new equipment to their forces and abandoning older equipment. Just as they add new equipment to their forces without abandoning older equipment, the Soviets have modernized operational and tactical principles without fully abandoning earlier ones. So as well as their principles, they don't just disregard older stuff too, just like vehicles. We don't have, like, all our old Leopard tanks in the Australian Army are sitting out the front of bases welded up just as for a gate entrance, rather than keeping all that in reserve so you can actually exert massive losses and accept the absorption of those losses too. Now, the most significant points are here in how they see battle. He who gets the initial battle with the most wins. That's how the Soviets at least see it. The enemy must be confronted with more than one situation to deal with, many different fronts, attritional phase of war. One should not be diverted by geographical objectives. They should concentrate on the destruction of the enemy's military forces. So it's far more attritional than a lot of where our stuff sits around this maneuver, surprise, short, aggressive war and win in a few months. And the Soviet layout of rank works better like this too. And so when I say Soviet, you can interact that with, like we've just spoken about, they don't abandon older plans. The West is so heavily reliant on NCOs, but if you have large losses in the NCO core, the ability to conduct these high-level maneuver operations really drops down. This is why the Russians can absorb much, much higher losses. You don't have that training massive NCO core that takes years and years to develop. You've got a couple of officers, a lot of troops, so you can actually absorb more losses. And in this, that they're willing to exert massive expense as well. Design actions to preempt the opponent to keep him reacting to situations that you control. Concentrate the enemy's weak points rather than his strength. So proper, just attritional doctrine through this. That their military strategy in their law, second law side, which can best sustain protracted war, will win the war. The higher the protracted stakes of a war, the longer and more violent it will be. The political stakes of this war could not be higher. Both Ukraine and Russia see it as existential to their states to continue and win this war. The war aims must be seen as just. Modern war cannot be waged without public support. So again, this is what the Soviets say about their own military doctrine and how they see when and how to launch wars and where you will win. Now, I'm not saying that is right or wrong. I'm saying that if we overlay that with the attritional phase of the war that we are currently in, you may get a better idea of how things are going. Many will say that Ukraine need to continue this move. They need to get back into maneuver warfare, not what we are seeing at the moment of this just grinding attritional phase. Recognition of wars of this scale cannot be resolved in a single decisive campaign. Not one battle will win this war. We spoke about that on the Protracted Warfare book, that it's not, we need to get away from one decisive battle to overall. You need to win the war, not the battles. The ability of large states to establish deep defensive positions and reserves means that almost any campaign will culminate before achieving the war's strategic aims. Sound campaign design thus requires planning from the outset of multiple successive operations. The ideal approach to such campaign design focuses on minimising the operational pauses between campaigns in order to deprive the adversary of the ability to regain the initiative or establish defensive positions that would make subsequent operations too costly. This is the problem with the 2023 counteroffensive. It's now been 18 months since then, so everything that was lost in there has basically been rebuilt, from the defensive works to this or that. That this is saying there was such a focus on, like, this is one decisive push and sweep and win, and if you can't then have a successive campaign after that, you've given the other side, the Russians in this case, the time to then rebuild everything here. The Ukrainians and their supporters must thus accept, until the conditions change, a successful operational penetration and exploitation will be followed by a Russian counterattack and the need to conduct another risky and costly penetration in the successive campaign. So one, then again, then again. But of course, this is very difficult when we have the amount of ammunition that is coming in is sort of stop-start with Ukraine, but also the mobilization at the moment. It's funny to see that where is that actually of people to be trained and sent into successive campaigns as well. Operations with limited pauses reduce long-term costs and risks. That the campaign, the offensive campaign, if Ukraine go on the offensive again, the 23 successes is going to have no influence on that at all. It's been too far away even now. Ukraine face enormous challenges today and in the months to come. Ukrainian forces are very unlikely to be able to initiate significant counteroffensive operations in 24 and into 25. Their ability to do so still rests on the accelerated and sustained provision of Western security assistance and the lifting of restrictions and on the use of assistance, as well as their ability to sustain an improved mobilisation and training system. It does not follow, however, the Ukrainian forces should plan simply to remain on the defensive or the indefinite future while trying to amass resources needed for a counteroffensive. This should be a time of experimentation, that make it messy that we talked about, trying different areas. On the contrary, they should increasingly let Ukraine challenge Russian forces for the initiative in parts of the theatre while exploring opportunities for future, more substantial counteroffensive operations as conditions permit. That said, we don't know about how much the Ukrainian side is being attrited down by the Russians either. Now, tactical reconnaissance strike complex is the use of drones and ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance with conventional weapons and then it itself as a weapon. Neither Ukraine can resign itself to the supposed reality of permanent positional warfare. The persistence of positional warfare depends, in fact, on the unstable dynamic developments of underlying TRSC, tactical reconnaissance strike complex, and cannot be taken for granted. The Russians may find a way to restore manoeuvre if the Ukrainians do not do it first. So this Ukraine needs to get back into manoeuvre and experiment in areas. But where I disagree with this article is I don't know if the Russians ever actually want to go back to manoeuvre warfare. I think with their defensive works and that grind forward, they want to stay in the attritional phase. And I think the Russian doctrine more aligns with that as well. Absorbing areas, absorbing losses, enveloping absorption, and just continuing on. But positional warfare, more importantly, will not liberate the strategically vital lands Ukraine must win back in order to be secure against future Russian aggression. So we know where Russia want to go, at least the 4 oblasts they want to maintain in Crimea. That is far closer, and the attritional phase will meet that at some point. Ukraine have a hell of a lot more ground to take back, and they're going to need to actually be on. They can't do that positionally. It's going to have to be manoeuvred so much over a limited time that they need to go back on this at some point and restore manoeuvre, which is very difficult. And to secure against future Russian aggression wars down the path, or just the continuation of this war. It will also protract the war and dramatically increase its cost to Ukraine and to Ukraine's supporters. So if you just sit in this protraction, positional warfare moving, it's going to go much longer, potentially be much more expensive. Ukraine should thus seek every possible way of restoring manoeuvre to this war as soon as possible. Restoring operational level manoeuvre remains the central problem in this war. The Ukraine war took on a positional form following the 2022 Ukrainian counteroffensives that liberated parts of Kharkiv, Kherson. That's the last time we saw that massive manoeuvre elements of war actually in play. Neither Russia nor Ukraine has succeeded since then in penetrating each other's side's prepared defence lines sufficiently to engage in such operational manoeuvres since 2022, even though both have made tactical advances. So just get grinding forward, but to engage in that. But my argument is I don't know if Russia wants to engage in that either. The Russians, for example, seized the city of Bakhmut in 23, but were unable to exploit the game before Ukrainian forces were able to counterattack, re-establish currently prepared defences. The Russians seized the settlement of Avdiivka in Feb 24 and made attritional localised tactical gains thereafter, but have been able to prevent the Ukrainians from re-establishing current defensive positions. This in here is probably written, this is very recent, but that may be turned back very quickly. The Ukrainians penetrated the initial Russian prepared defensive positions in Zap Oblast during their 23 counteroffensives, but were similarly unable to exploit that penetration before the Russians reformed coherent defensive positions and counterattacked. Even the Russian offensive into Kharkiv Oblast in May 24 rapidly fell into a positional form as Ukrainian reinforcements established their defences. I'd argue that is exactly what we've seen happen in Kursk as well. Again, like I said, what we're basing all the knowledge off on this is the first time we're seeing a war like this with the amount of ISR and weapon systems coming into play. So it's hard to know exactly where things like me or this or whatever are going to be right or wrong. Implications for resourcing. The West must work with Ukraine to lay out the combination of simultaneous and successive defensive and offensive operations that Ukraine will have to conduct on the one hand and will have to conduct on the other. So you're doing both at the same time over the coming years to determine the resources required for each. This approach will require abandoning the effort to stockpile large amount of material in preparations for a single big offensive in 25. And of course, provision of equipment and not this stop-start if you're doing successive and simultaneous offensives, you can't have that stop-start, or nor can you just have all this stockpiling of equipment for one large foul swoop, because according to this, that is not what is going to happen. Focusing on supporting a series of planned successful operations, each of which is considerably more limited than a single massive offensive apparently contemplated for 2025. And this actual last one's by the ISW, by the way. This is what we're reading. It's very, very on Ukraine's side here. The challenges before Ukraine and its Western supporters are enormous. They are not, however, insurmountable. The Russians are not incompetent. They are serious and a determined foes. Their ranks include many innovative people seeking to identify and solve the same problems identified above. It would be a terrible mistake to underestimate them. Exactly like I think we have seen after the failures in 2022, there was a level of complacency. Russia obviously benefits from many numerical advantages. The size alone has rarely determined the outcomes for wars, though there are a lot of other cases where size alone does determine this. The long history of war makes clear that manoeuvre will ultimately be restored to the battlefield despite the current challenges. But who will then restore that manoeuvre first? How far does Russia want to go with that manoeuvre if there is a breakthrough, or grind up to then the borders of the oblast of which they're looking to occupy? So we will see. But I hope you got something out of all of that to talk about manoeuvre, attritional war, how I see it, the prolonged aspect of this, and how we may see things moving in the beginning and how we can relate that to areas we are seeing now. If there's a lot of cuts in this, I couldn't really read it well, at least out loud. Look after yourselves. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.